Hey, you found us.
Welcome, everybody.
This is Scripture Gems. Hello, and welcome to the show. My name is John Fullmer, and this is my brother Jay.
How's it going, John?
We are two brothers who just can't get enough of the Scriptures.
Yeah, we love them.
This episode, we are going over the Come Follow Me lesson for January 11th through 17th, 2021. This is covering Doctrine and Covenants, Section 2, and Joseph Smith History, verses 27 through 65. And now, let's bring out the star of the show, the Scriptures.
So excited to have you here, Scriptures.
Looking forward to it. And now let's consult the Scripturematic 6000 to find out how long it will take to read this week's reading. 22 minutes, 6 seconds.
Not bad. And how about daily?
3 minutes, 9 seconds.
Excellent. We've got time codes here for what we're going to talk about. You can skip to those topics if you like. Otherwise, buckle up and enjoy the ride.
And what a ride it is. This was a really fun lesson to put together. There were several new discoveries for both Jay and I. And I think one of the more interesting ones to me is that I never realized that the source for Doctrine and Covenants Section 2 is this history of Joseph Smith that we're reading. So the history of Joseph Smith that later became the history of the church, this is where the source text for Doctrine and Covenants Section 2 comes from. And so we'll go over that when we get to it.
So as we're going to start in verse 28, understand that the events in these verses happened between the ages of 14 to 17. So when you're listening to him talk about his struggles, maybe you might reflect back on the time when you were a teenager, or if you are now, maybe this sounds familiar to you. So let's start in Joseph Smith history in verse 28. And remember, what we talked about before was this incredible heavenly vision that Joseph had in the sacred grove. But what happened after? In verse 28, during the space of time which intervened between the time I had the vision and the year 1823, having been forbidden to join any of the religious sects of the day, and being of very tender years, and persecuted by those who ought to have been my friends, and if they had supposed me to be deluded, to have endeavored in a proper and affectionate manner to have reclaimed me. I was left to all kinds of temptations, and mingling with all kinds of society, I frequently fell into many foolish errors and displayed the weakness of youth and the foibles of human nature.
From the Pearl of Great Price Institute manual, I found a quote from Neil A. Maxwell. This is from his book, Notwithstanding My Weakness. He says, quote, just as God cannot look upon sin with the least degree of allowance, as we become more like him, neither can we. The best people have a heightened awareness of what little of the worst is still in them, end quote.
And that's something I really find great about this admission by Joseph Smith. And, you know, in the verse, he makes it clear that we need not suppose him guilty of any great or malignant sin. But the point is that he cares that he's not where he could be. And that's a great compliment, especially if we're struggling. You know, so much we compare ourselves to other people. We need to compare ourselves with who we were yesterday. And if we want to improve that, then be a better person today. And that's what Joseph was feeling. So going on in verse 29, in consequence of these things, I often felt condemned for my weakness and imperfections. When on the evening of the above-mentioned 21st of September, after I had retired to my bed for the night. Now let's set the stage for the event that follows. The Institute Manual for the Pearl of Great Price has a great summary. It says, in 1822, Joseph began helping his older brother Alvin build a new frame house for the family. By September 1823, it was 2 stories high but without a roof. The family therefore continued to live in a small log house a short distance from the frame house. It is to the log house, not the frame house, that Moroni went. Joseph would have undoubtedly slept in the same room with some of his brothers because the log house was very small for a family of 9. And as a side note, I could point out I've been in that house, and I can't imagine 9 people in there.
And we would know, coming from a family of 9 ourselves.
Yes, indeed. It's something we're well familiar with. Continuing on in verse 29, I betook myself to prayer and supplication to Almighty God for forgiveness of all my sins and follies, and also for a manifestation to me that I might know of my state and standing before him. For I had full confidence in obtaining a divine manifestation, as I previously had one. I'm so impressed with Joseph caring about his state before God, and that he worries about that. So think for a minute about what Joseph did about the guilt he felt for his sins and shortcomings. Notice that he prayed for forgiveness and asked to know what his standing was before God. Think about what we can learn from that example. It's not just repenting when we've done wrong, but what might be the blessing of us continuing to ask God to know how we're doing with him. In other words, Lord, what lack I yet? In the seminary manual, there's a great quote from Elder Neil L. Anderson from a talk, Repent That I May Heal You, in the October 2009 General Conference. He says, "We can humbly petition the Lord, Father, what wouldst thou have me do?" The answers come. We feel the changes we need to make. The Lord tells us in our mind and in our heart.
And similarly, there's an encouragement in the Come Follow Me manual from President Russell M. Nelson. This is from a worldwide devotional for young adults that was given on January 10th, 2016, called Becoming True Millennials. He says, quote, "Ask your Heavenly Father, in the name of Jesus Christ, how he feels about you and your mission here on earth. If you ask with real intent, over time the Spirit will whisper the life-changing truth to you. I promise you that when you begin to catch even a glimpse of how your Heavenly Father sees you and what he is counting on you to do for him, your life will never be the same." End quote.
Oh, I love it.
It's an important promise.
Yeah, it sure is. And how important to use our Father in heaven as the mirror through which we see ourselves, and not the bitter glass that the world holds up.
So what happened? Let's go on to verse 30. "While I was thus in the act of calling upon God, I discovered a light appearing in my room, which continued to increase until the room was lighter than at noonday, when immediately a personage appeared at my bedside, standing in the air, for his feet did not touch the floor." Now, interesting side note. If you look at the Come Follow Me manual for this lesson, either the physical or the electronic, there is a painting at the top of it that's titled "He Called Me by Name" by Michael Malm. And it shows Joseph seeing Moroni, but there's a sleeping brother right next to Joseph.
I love that.
I love that.
Yeah,
it's a great portrayal, but it also helps us understand that, as Jay pointed out from the Institute manual, they were living in the log house, and so they were most likely sleeping together in a room, at least the brothers.
Yeah.
And it's amazing that you could have this vision where the light appearing in my room, which continued to increase until the room was lighter than at noonday, and yet everyone around him is still asleep.
Well, and if you've ever slept through something that you've regretted sleeping through, can you imagine waking up and going, I missed what? What? I was right there. Now, I think it's fair to say that the vision will be shown to whoever the vision is supposed to be shown to, but still so cool.
Yeah.
And I'd like to point out that Michael Malm is awesome. I really love his stuff, and this is a wonderful painting. I always use this when I teach this section for that very reason that John was describing. So, love it.
Great stuff. So he goes on to describe Moroni in the next few verses, but jumping ahead to verse 33, "He called me by name and said unto me that he was a messenger sent from the presence of God to me, and that his name was Moroni, that God had a work for me to do, and that my name should be had for good and evil among all nations, kindreds, and tongues, or that it should be both good and evil spoken of among all people."
Now, isn't that amazing? He calls him by name, he announces who he is, says that God has a work for him to do, and then he doesn't sugarcoat this at all. People are going to love you, people are going to hate you. And not just locally, but there's a whole world over the history of this amazing work that people are going to praise you and speak evil of you. And you just need to know that right up front.
Now let's talk about this for a minute. All of you who are listening, most of you who are listening, when we said that his name is Moroni, first of all, you probably have already heard this story before, but even if you haven't, when I say his name was Moroni, If you were with us last year, you know who Moroni is. Oh, hey, I know this guy. We talked about him last year.
Yeah.
Great. Joseph has never heard of him.
No.
He has no idea what this is
Yeah.
about and why this person is talking to him and
Yeah.
why this person is now telling him you're going to be loved and hated throughout the world. This has got to be just a crazy experience.
Yeah. And he hasn't even led into the fact that there's going to be a book deposited, which is essentially, going to tell you about me. But yeah, that's a great point, John.
From the Pearl of Great Price Institute manual, I found this quote from Elder Neil A. Maxwell. This is from October 1983 General Conference. He says, quote, "Young Joseph was told that his name would be both good and evil spoken of throughout the world. Except from a divine source, how audacious a statement! Yet his contemporary religious leaders, then much better known than Joseph, have faded into the footnotes of history, while the work of Joseph Smith grows constantly and globally." End quote. Love that.
Only with the work of the Lord.
Absolutely. Going on in verse 34, he said, "There was a book deposited, written upon gold plates, giving an account of the former inhabitants of this continent and the source from whence they sprang. He also said that the fullness of the everlasting gospel was contained in it, as delivered by the Savior to the ancient inhabitants."
I'd really like to read this book. It sounds interesting. How can I find out more?
Well, we've got a whole year's worth of episodes you can talk about.
Oh, we should do that. Yeah. I mean, how amazing does that sound? But then Moroni essentially says, let's put a pin in that. I'm going to tease you with this piece of information. We'll talk more about this later. And then he will go on to talk about some other very important things. Let's take a look in verse 36. He says, "After telling me these things, he commenced quoting the prophecies of the Old Testament."
Now, why the Old Testament?
Yeah, and what is he going to quote? What is it from there that is so special? Well, now in verse 36, it says he first quoted part of the 3rd chapter of Malachi. But which part? We don't know.
There's a good case to be made for Malachi chapter 3, verses 1 through 4 and 16 through 18, because they are appropriate to the themes of the other scriptures. But Jay's right. We don't know.
Interesting. Joseph says he quoted also the 4th or last chapter of the same prophecy, though with a little variation from the way it reads in our Bibles. And that's intriguing.
Yes, it is.
Now, there's no reason to think that in these changes, Moroni was correcting the text of Malachi. The Savior quoted these passages verbatim from the Old Testament in 3 Nephi 25. Rather, the Lord here is giving new insights to the meaning of those verses as they apply to what's happening here. So when we see those differences, we should be asking, why is that important?
And some of them may be important, and some of them may not be as important. Let's take a look at some of the first ones in Joseph Smith History, verse 37, and compare that to Malachi 4, chapter 1. In Joseph Smith History, it says, "For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, yea, and all that do wickedly, shall burn as stubble." Now the King James Version has, "shall be stubble. For they that come shall burn them." King James Version says, "and the day that cometh shall burn them up." And that's an interesting contrast.
Mm-hmm.
Back to the verse. "Saith the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave them neither root nor branch."
Now, there's an interesting insight that we get from Jacob chapter 5 in the allegory of the olive vineyard, which Joseph wouldn't have had access to. But in thinking of that, in that phrasing where he quotes Malachi, "For they that come shall burn them," it refers to the servants of the Lord who will bring forth his word, and through judging people on that word, the judgment will come upon them. So it's interesting that we're looking at this now as a role of people serving the Lord in bringing his gospel about.
Now, in the next few verses, Joseph is telling us what Moroni is quoting from Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 through 6. This is the source material for Doctrine and Covenants, section 2, leaving out the narration pieces.
This is interesting because these are the only verses from what Moroni was saying that are set apart as their own section in the Doctrine and Covenants, and this stands as one of the earliest revelations of this dispensation. It was given to Joseph Smith when he was 17 years old. And so, as short as this is really important.
How important? Well, we've talked about this in a previous lesson last year, but this prophecy appears in every standard work of the church. It appears in the Old Testament in Malachi. It appears in the New Testament in Luke. It appears in the Book of Mormon in 3 Nephi 25. Jesus himself is quoting it. It appears in the Doctrine and Covenants as section 2. And let's remember that Doctrine and Covenants also includes the fulfillment of that prophecy in D&C 110. And it is included here in the Pearl of Great Price in the Joseph Smith history. Maybe it's something we need to pay close attention to.
Maybe it is. So let's do that. And by the way, if you're interested in actually taking a look at the original documents, we've mentioned before the Joseph Smith Papers Project. I'll put a link in the description. There's a page that shows the source material behind each of the sections in the Doctrine and Covenants. You just click on those and it will show you scans of the pages, which is really cool.
That project is so great. Please check it out. It's really good.
Yeah, you'll love it.
So let's take a look at the verse.
And in doing so, let's break it into 4 categories. We're going to be looking at it as priesthood, promises, penalty, and priority.
Okay, so now instead of reading from Joseph Smith history, we are going to be reading from Doctrine and Covenants, section 2. Verse 1, Behold, I will reveal unto you the priesthood by the hand of Elijah the prophet. Now in the King James Version, it's simply, I will send you Elijah the prophet, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord.
There's an interesting phrase in there, too, when it says that Elijah was not going to restore the priesthood. We know who's going to restore the priesthood, but that he was to reveal the priesthood. From the Come Follow Me manual, there's a great quote from President Henry B. Eyring from the April 2005 General Conference. He says, Elijah was a great prophet with great power given him by God. He held the greatest power God gives to his children. He held the sealing power, the power to bind on earth and have it bound in heaven. Joseph Fielding Smith taught in Doctrines of Salvation that the sealing power puts the stamp of approval upon every ordinance that's done in the church. He goes on to explain this idea that we can do a baptism here. We can have the priesthood authority to do it, but it's the sealing power that binds these ordinances beyond this life. And whether we think of it in terms of, say, eternal marriage and so forth, but all the ordinances. So the sealing power, very important.
So now we're going into the promises section. Verse 2, And he shall plant in the hearts of the children the promises made to the fathers. Now, King James Version says, And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children. Going on, And the hearts of the children shall turn to their fathers. King James Version says, And the heart of the children to their fathers.
Yeah, these are some interesting distinctions. Let's talk first about the overall idea of the verse as it relates to promises. President Joseph Fielding Smith, again in Doctrines of Salvation, says that the phrase, their fathers, refers to our dead ancestors who died without the privilege of receiving the gospel, but who received the promise that the time would come when the privilege would be granted them. The children are those now living who are preparing genealogical data and who are performing the vicarious ordinances in the temples. It's also interesting to note that phrasing at the beginning of the verse John pointed out, the phrase to plant in the hearts. The heart is often referred to as the depository of feelings. So rather than saying turning the heart to their fathers, this idea of planting in the hearts of the children the promises made to the fathers, the sense that we will begin to feel and care for and be concerned about those that have come before and wanting to help them and serve them. I think that's a beautiful image. If you've caught the bug for genealogical and family history work, you know what that feels like to have that planted in your heart and let it grow and overtake.
Yeah, as Jay pointed out, there's a common phrase in the church to have the spirit of Elijah, and that's something that drives you to know more about your ancestors and to research and do their ordinance work. This is what we're talking about, this verse right here.
Yeah.
Now let's go on to verse 3. This is the penalty section. If it were not so, the whole earth would be utterly wasted at his coming. Now what's interesting is that the King James Version says, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse.
Yeah, interesting change in the phrase. And by the way, this is okay. God will often take things that meant one thing to one group at one time, and because I think of their familiarity, take them and tweak them. And not to get too far off topic, but the Last Supper is a great example of that. That was the Feast of the Passover. He took the Feast of the Passover and reinterpreted it for the new covenant. We call it the sacrament, his reinterpretation. So for the Lord to take these verses and tweak them to apply to this day is, I think, rather exciting. This notion that the earth would be utterly wasted at his coming, wasted implies the earth has purpose and would be denied the fulfillment of this purpose if these things in verses 1 and 2 were not so. In the seminary manual, it gives us a quote from President Joseph Fielding Smith, again from the Doctrines of Salvation. He says, "Why would the earth be wasted? Simply because if there is not a welding link between the fathers and the children, which is the work for the dead, then we will all stand rejected. The whole work of God will fail and be utterly wasted." And this brings us to our last thought here, and that's priority. Think for a minute about the placement of this prophecy. Following the first vision, this is the first divine revelation of Joseph Smith, and it relates to the importance of the eternal nature of the family. What is the priority in God's work? The exaltation of the family. And does this increase the significance of this well-known teaching by President Harold B. Lee when he says, "The most important of the Lord's work that you will ever do will be within the walls of your own home"? That's from an area conference report in Mexico City, August 26th, 1972. If you're interested in more about this idea of Elijah the prophet being sent, a past Sperry Symposium had a really good paper called "I Will Send You Elijah the Prophet" by Kenneth L. Alford. I'll put the link in the description. He looks at what people believed about how it would happen and what would happen and so forth in Joseph's day, and then shows the fulfillment of that being in stark contrast to a lot of what was believed at the time. But a lot of people were thinking about this and trying to understand this. So it's interesting that that would be in the people's mind and that the Lord would reveal it this way. So I'll put the link in the description. You can check it out.
Very good. All right, going on in verse 40, Joseph tells us that Moroni quoted the 11th chapter of Isaiah, saying that it was about to be fulfilled. Now, that's exciting. We won't cover Isaiah 11 here, but we do have a past lesson on 2 Nephi 21 that you might find interesting. This is a prophecy about the stem of Jesse, or Christ, who will judge in righteousness, and Israel will be gathered. So Moroni is telling us that this is about to be fulfilled. As I mentioned, 2 Nephi 21 quotes this prophecy, and we did a lesson on that. Also, Doctrine and Covenants section 113, verses 1 through 6, contains a direct Q&A about this chapter, about certain parts of it. That's why we know, for example, that the stem of Jesse mentioned is Jesus Christ. Going on, he also quotes Acts chapter 3, verses 22 through 23. Hey, wait a minute. Now we've left the Old Testament and we're going into the New Testament. So that's kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. From verse 40, he said that that prophet was Christ, but the day had not yet come when they who would not hear his voice should be cut off from among the people, but soon would come. Now, wait a minute. What's he talking about? Let's take a look at Acts chapter 3, verses 22 to 23. Verse 22, "For Moses truly said unto the fathers, A prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me. Him shall ye hear in all things whatsoever he shall say unto you. And it shall come to pass that every soul which will not hear that prophet shall be destroyed from among the people." Okay, so Moroni said that that prophet was Christ, but the day had not come yet when they who would not hear his voice should be cut off from among the people. So that's coming later. Now, what's interesting about that prophecy, once again, this is another prophecy that appears in every one of our standard works. It's quoted in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy. It's in the New Testament, in Acts, in a couple of places in Acts. The Book of Mormon, 3rd Nephi, Doctrine and Covenants, 133, and, of course, the Pearl of Great Price as we're reading. This might be important. We might need to pay attention to this.
Good idea.
But why the Acts version? So we've got 5 different versions of this prophecy. Well, only 3 at this point. But why the Acts chapter 3 version? And I'm not sure. Moroni doesn't tell us. But maybe it's due to the fact that you have that little section in verse 23, where it shall come to pass that every soul which will not hear that prophet shall be destroyed. That's unique to Acts. Moroni goes on in verse 41, he quotes Joel chapter 2, verses 28 to 32, and says that this was not yet fulfilled, but was soon to be. Now, this had to have been very sobering for young Joseph to be told all of these Old Testament and New Testament prophecies and be told they're not fulfilled yet, but they're going to be shortly. Wow.
Yeah.
So here is Joel chapter 2, verses 28 to 32. 28, and it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. And here's an obvious example of the fulfillment of that prophecy, or a fulfillment.
Yeah, it's happening right now.
Verse 29, and also upon the servants and upon the handmaids in those days will I pour out my spirit, and I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and the terrible day of the Lord come. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be deliverance, as the Lord hath said, and in the remnant whom the Lord shall call. Now, going back to Joseph Smith history, in verse 41, we're also told he quoted many other passages of Scripture and offered many explanations, which cannot be mentioned here.
Oh, man.
Wait, what? Oh. Now, we don't know what these other verses are. Joseph didn't mention them, at least not in this history. However, from the Pearl of Great Price Institute manual, we get a great quote from the Latter-day Saints Messenger and Advocate, which included in the February 1835 edition. This is a letter from Oliver Cowdery to W. W. Phelps talking about Joseph's visit from Moroni. It says, quote, though fear was banished from his heart, yet his surprise was no less when he heard him declare himself to be a messenger sent by commandment of the Lord, to deliver a special message, and to witness to him that his sins were forgiven, and that his prayers were heard, and that the Scriptures might be fulfilled, which say, God has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the things which are mighty, and base things of the world, and things which are despised, has God chosen. Yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught things which are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. End quote. And that quote is from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 27 to 28. So that might be another verse that Moroni quoted.
Interesting.
The Institute manual also mentions that Oliver Cowdery also cited Moroni quoting, sometimes only in phrases, Isaiah 28, 21, Isaiah chapter 29, verses 11 through 14. That's significant, of course, with the Book of Mormon. And John chapter 10, verse 16, which is, of course, very significant as that's the other lost sheep.
That is incredible. It's great to have some at least possible other insights as to the breadth of what Moroni is trying to teach. And at the very least, Joseph, being familiar with the Bible, at least in some respect, may have understood or heard those prophecies before and is now seeing them in a new light. So let's go on with verse 42 in Joseph Smith history. We're moving back to this record that he told Joseph about. He's given instruction not to show these plates or the breastplate or the Urim and Thummim to anybody. He says, only to those to whom I should be commanded to show them. If I did, I should be destroyed. So then Joseph's given a vision of the location of the plates. And in 43, he says after all this, I saw the light in the room began to gather immediately around the person of him who had been speaking to me. And it continued to do so until the room was again left dark, except just around him, when instantly I saw, as it were, a conduit open right up into heaven, and he ascended till he entirely disappeared, and the room was left as it had been before this heavenly light had made its appearance. So in 44 and 45, Joseph is, as you can imagine, meditating on what just happened. And Moroni returns and repeats everything he just said. Why? Well, we're left to wonder, except that, as you can tell from what we just talked about, that was a lot of stuff.
And maybe it was important?
Maybe.
And maybe it was important that he remembered it?
He didn't mention he was taking any notes, so he comes again, but there's an addition this time. He gives all the information before, and then in verse 45, he says, he informed me of great judgments which were coming upon the earth, with great desolations by famine, sword, and pestilence, and that these grievous judgments would come on the earth in this generation. And then Moroni leaves again. And in 46 through 47, Joseph describes himself as no longer tired. He says, sleep had fled from my eyes, when Moroni comes a third time and repeats everything he had said previously. Joseph says that Moroni had added a caution to me, telling me that Satan would try to tempt me in consequence of the indigent circumstances of my father's family, meaning they were poor, to get the plates for the purpose of getting rich. This he forbade me, saying that I must have no other object in view in getting the plates but to glorify God, and must not be influenced by any other motive than that of building his kingdom. Otherwise I could not get them. Then Moroni leaves the third time, and the cock crows. It's morning.
So now in verse 48, Joseph attempts to get up and go about the, quote, necessary labors of the day, but he's exhausted. Now, we learn from Joseph Smith and examples in the scriptures that divine spiritual manifestations like this are physically exhausting anyway, but on top of that, Joseph has had little or no sleep. So, yeah.
Yikes.
He's exhausted. From verse 48, I started with the intention of going to the house, but in attempting to cross the fence out of the field where we were, my strength entirely failed me, and I fell helpless to the ground, and for a time was quite unconscious of anything. The first thing I can recollect was a voice speaking unto me, calling me by name. I looked up and beheld the same messenger standing over my head, surrounded by light as before. He then again related unto me all that he had related to me the previous night, and commanded me to go to my father and tell him of the vision and commandments which I had received. So once again, fourth time, I'm going over everything again. Maybe this was important.
Yeah.
But why tell his father? Why was that important? Is it possible that Joseph Sr. had already received inspiration that something was happening, and he needed to confirm to his son that, quote, it was of God, as we see in verse 50? In the Pearl of Great Price Institute manual, there's a segment of Lucy Mack Smith, History of Joseph Smith by his mother, that I wanted to include. She says, quote, the messenger whom he saw the previous night visited him again, and the first thing he said was, why did you not tell your father that which I commanded you to tell him? Joseph replied, I was afraid my father would not believe me. The angel rejoined, he will believe every word you say to him.
Oh, that's awesome. There's a section in the book Saints, Volume 1 on page 24. When talking about this account, it says, Joseph Sr. wept when his son told him about the angel and his message. He said, "It was a vision from God. Attend to it."
I love that.
And by the way, please don't forget that the story behind, well, this story can be found in a wonderful way. Saints uses a lot of resources to pull together the account that it gives, and it's so easy to read, so highly recommended.
Love Saints. Yay!
Yay! Okay, let's go on. Verses 50 through 52, back to Joseph Smith history. Joseph immediately goes to the hill that he saw in a vision. His strength maybe returned?
Well, he was unconscious for a while. Maybe he had kind of a power nap.
Maybe so. So he gets to the hill and he finds, hidden under a large boulder, partially buried in earth, a cement box containing the plates, the breastplate, and the Urim and Thummim. In verse 53, he says, "I made an attempt to take them out, but was forbidden by the messenger, and was again informed that the time for bringing them forth had not yet arrived, neither would it until 4 years from that time. But he told me that I should come to that place precisely in 1 year from that time, and that he would there meet with me, and that I should continue to do so until the time should come for obtaining the plates." And that's interesting, to be shown what your goal is, and then be given 4 years to train, and what interesting training he gets in order to prepare for that moment.
Now, this is a story that's well known to members of the church, but I wanted to include another account that adds a little bit more light to it. This is from the Institute Manual, Church History in the Fullness of Times. Love this manual.
Love that manual.
This is chapter 4. And this is sourced mostly from articles that Oliver Cowdery wrote about this in the Latter-day Saints Messenger and Advocate, a publication of the church in 1835. It says, quote, "As Joseph approached the hill Cumorah, he had thoughts about the poverty of his family and the possibility that the plates or the popularity of the translation would produce enough wealth to raise him above a level with the common earthly fortunes of his fellow men and relieve his family from want. When he reached down for the plates, he received a shock and was thus prevented from taking them out of the box. Twice more he tried and was thrown back. In frustration, he cried out, 'Why can I not obtain this book?' Moroni appeared and told him it was because he had not kept the commandments, but had yielded to the temptations of Satan to obtain the plates for riches instead of having his eye single to the glory of God as he had been commanded. Repentant, Joseph humbly sought the Lord in prayer and was filled with the Spirit. A vision was opened to him, and the glory of the Lord shone round about and rested upon him. He beheld the prince of darkness. The heavenly messenger Moroni said, 'All this is shown, the good and the evil, the holy and impure, the glory of God and the power of darkness, that you may know hereafter the two powers, and never be influenced or overcome by that wicked one. You now see why you could not obtain this record, that the commandment was strict, and that if ever these sacred things are obtained, they must be by prayer and faithfulness in obeying the Lord. They are not deposited here for the sake of accumulating gain and wealth for the glory of this world. They were sealed by the prayer of faith, and because of the knowledge which they contain, they are of no worth among the children of men, only for their knowledge.' Moroni concluded by warning Joseph that he would not be allowed to obtain the plates until he had learned to keep the commandments of God, not only till he was willing but able to do it."
I find this interesting that Moroni is giving him this warning about, not seeking for temporal gain in this, but that it's the knowledge that it contains that's its value, when he gave that warning 1,400 years earlier. When he wrote in Mormon chapter 8, verses 14 and 15, he was writing to he who would translate. And now here he is talking to the guy the Lord chose for this great work and giving him that same warning that he had been writing about 1,400 years ago. I find that really interesting.
That's really cool. And that must have been interesting when Joseph would later translate that and say, oh, yeah, Moroni told me that.
He told me that. Yep.
Going on with the quote, the ensuing evening, when the family were all together, Joseph made known to them all that he had communicated to his father in the field, and also of his finding the record, as well as what passed between him and the angel while he was at the place where the plates were deposited. End quote. Great stuff.
Yeah, it's great to have that background. Let's take a look at verse 54 back in Joseph Smith history. In verse 54, it says, accordingly as I had been commanded, I went at the end of each year, and at each time I found the same messenger there and received instruction and intelligence from him at each of our interviews, respecting what the Lord was going to do and how and in what manner his kingdom was to be conducted in the last days. Now, let's take a look at this visit. It mentions that he goes each year. Let's look at visit number 2, the second year that he comes back. This is an account from the book Saints, Volume 1, and this is on pages 29 through 30. It says, Moroni's instructions for retrieving the plates were clear. You must take them into your hands and go straight to the house without delay, the angel had said, and lock them up. And this is interesting because we know he doesn't get the plates until the 4th visit, but here are these instructions for getting them at his 2nd visit. Going back to the book. At the hill, Joseph pried up the rock, reached into the stone box, and lifted out the plates. A thought then crossed his mind. The other items in the box were valuable and ought to be hidden before he went home. He set the plates down and turned to cover the box. But when he returned to the plates, they were gone. Alarmed, he fell to his knees and pleaded to know where they were. Moroni appeared and told Joseph that he had failed to follow the directions again. Not only had he set the plates down before safely securing them, he had also let them out of his sight. As willing as the young seer was to do the Lord's work, he was not yet able to protect the ancient record. I love that.
I love that account.
It's so great because we're all like that. I mean, Moroni couldn't have been more clear as to the instructions, and yet he was thinking, oh, I should do this. And it was a fine thing to think about. He wasn't being nefarious, but he wasn't being specific to the Lord's instructions. He hadn't trusted the Lord yet enough to do exactly what the Lord said. And this is great training.
There were some additional references given in the Pearl of Great Price Institute manual about this time period. From Lucy Mack Smith's History of Joseph Smith by his mother, she says that during this time, quote, Joseph continued to receive instructions from the Lord. And President John Taylor said, quote, when Joseph Smith was raised up as a prophet of God, Mormon, Moroni, Nephi, and others of the ancient prophets who formerly lived on this continent, and Peter and John and others who lived on the Asiatic continent, came to him and communicated to him certain principles pertaining to the gospel of the Son of God. That's from the Journal of Discourses, Volume 17.
That's such amazing training. It's important to remember that this is a huge thing that Joseph, an uneducated farm boy, is being asked to do. And yet look at the education he's getting from some of the greatest church leaders of the ancient past.
And what was the result of this training? Well, Joseph Smith's mother again mentions in her History of Joseph Smith, quote, during our evening conversations, Joseph would occasionally give us some of the most amusing recitals that could be imagined. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, mode of traveling, and the animals upon which they rode, their cities, their buildings, with every particular, their mode of warfare, and also their religious worship. This he would do with as much ease, seemingly, as if he had spent his whole life among them. End quote. That had to have been really neat.
No kidding. Well, let's take a look here in verses 55 through 58. Joseph continues his life as a day laborer. He said, as my father's worldly circumstances were very limited. In the year 1823, my father's family, he says, met with a great affliction by the death of my eldest brother, Alvin. In the Church History and the Fullness of Times manual, chapter 4, It says Alvin was a faithful and serious young man, and Joseph idolized him. Joseph saw in him a guileless person who lived an upright life. Alvin loved Joseph too and was greatly interested in the sacred record. As death neared, he counseled Joseph, "I want you to be a good boy and do everything that lies in your power to obtain the record. Be faithful in receiving instruction and in keeping every commandment that is given you." Joseph learned by revelation years later that Alvin was an heir to the celestial kingdom. And we'll learn about that in Doctrine and Covenants 137. After this time, Joseph meets Emma Hale and marries her in spite of the family's disapproval in 1827. He says in verse 58, "Immediately after my marriage, I left Mr. Stoll's and went to my father's and farmed with him that season."
Now let's take a look at verse 59 of Joseph Smith history. "At length the time arrived for obtaining the plates, the Urim and Thummim, and the breastplate. On the 22nd day of September, 1827, having gone as usual at the end of another year to the place where they were deposited, the same heavenly messenger delivered them up to me with this charge, that I should be responsible for them, that if I should let them go carelessly or through any neglect of mine, I should be cut off, but that if I would use all my endeavors to preserve them until he, the messenger, should call for them, they should be protected. I soon found out the reason why I had received such strict charges to keep them safe, and why it was that the messenger had said that when I had done what was required at my hand, he would call for them. For no sooner was it known that I had them, than the most strenuous exertions were used to get them from me. Every stratagem that could be invented was resorted to for that purpose. The persecution became more bitter and severe than before, and multitudes were on the alert continually to get them from me if possible. But by the wisdom of God, they remained safe in my hands until I had accomplished by them what was required at my hand. When, according to arrangements, the messenger called for them, I delivered them up to him, and he has them in his charge until this day, being the 2nd day of May, 1838.
Now, the church history in the fullness of times gives us a little background on what was happening during that event. In chapter 4, it says, "Long before sunrise on the 22nd of September, 1827, Joseph and his wife hitched Joseph Knight's horse to Josiah Stowell's spring wagon and drove the 3 miles to the hill Cumorah. Leaving Emma at the base, Joseph climbed the hill for his final interview with Moroni. Moroni gave him the plates, the Urim and Thummim, and the breastplate. He also gave Joseph a specific warning and promise concerning his responsibilities. Joseph was now responsible for those sacred objects, and if he was careless or negligent and lost them, he would be cut off. On the other hand, if he used all his efforts to preserve them until Moroni returned for them, he was assured that they would be protected." For the first time in over 1,400 years, the precious records were entrusted to a mortal. Joseph carefully hid the plates in a hollow log near his home. The prophet's friends were not the only ones who eagerly anticipated his receiving the plates. Others in the neighborhood had heard that Joseph was going to bring home valuable metal plates. Some of them may have also been involved in searching for the silver mine, and now felt they should have a share in any treasure. Joseph soon learned why Moroni had strictly charged him to protect the plates. Every stratagem that could be invented was used to get them from him. For example, Willard Chase, a neighboring farmer, along with other treasure seekers, sent for a sorcerer to come and find the place where the plates were hidden. When the Smiths learned of the plot, they sent Emma to get Joseph, who was working in Macedon a few miles west of Palmyra. He returned immediately and retrieved the plates. Wrapping them in a linen frock, he started through the woods, thinking it might be safer than the traveled road. But just as he jumped over a log, he was struck from behind with a gun. Joseph, however, was able to knock his assailant down and flee. Half a mile later, he was assaulted again, but managed to escape. And before he arrived home, he was accosted a 3rd time. His mother said that when he reached home, he was altogether speechless from fright and the fatigue of running. Efforts to steal the plates intensified, but Moroni's promise of protection was also fulfilled. Joseph often moved the plates from their hiding place just minutes before the treasure seekers arrived. Once he hid them under the hearthstone of the fireplace of his home. A large group of men gathered in front of the house, but they scattered when Joseph and his brothers faked a counterattack by running out the front door, screaming and yelling as if a large company of men were assisting them. Joseph then hid the chest under the wooden floor of the cooper shop on the Smith farm, but he was prompted to conceal the records themselves under the flax in the loft. That night, his enemies tore up the floor of the cooper shop, but the plates remained safe.
I love that. It's really great to have so many accounts all together. It gives us a much better feel for what Joseph was going through at this time. So now going on in verse 61, due to persecution and attempts by some to steal the plates, as we just talked about, Joseph and Emma move, but have little money to do so. In verse 61, we're told, "In the midst of our afflictions, we found a friend in a gentleman by the name of Martin Harris, who came to us and gave me $50 to assist us on our journey." So Joseph begins copying the characters off the plates and translating some of them. Martin Harris takes these characters and translation to New York City to specialists in ancient language. And while we're talking about Martin Harris, there was a neat quote from Church History in the Fullness of Time, chapter 4, saying, quote, "According to his own testimony, Martin was instructed by the Lord in 1818 not to join any church until the words of Isaiah were fulfilled," end quote. Now that'll be particularly interesting when we look at this next segment.
Yeah, let's take a look at that fulfillment. Let's start in verse 64, which is Martin Harris's account of what happened. He says, "I went to the city of New York and presented the characters which had been translated, with the translation thereof to Professor Charles Anthon, a gentleman celebrated for his literary attainments. Professor Anthon stated that the translation was correct, more so than any he had before seen translated from the Egyptian. I then showed him those which were not yet translated, and he said that they were Egyptian, Chaldaic, Assyriac, and Arabic, and he said that they were true characters. He gave me a certificate certifying to the people of Palmyra that they were true characters, and that the translation of such of them as had been translated was also correct. I took the certificate and put it into my pocket, and was just leaving the house when Mr. Anthon called me back, and asked me how the young man found out that there were gold plates in the place where he found them. I answered that an angel of God had revealed it unto him. He then said to me, 'Let me see that certificate.' I accordingly took it out of my pocket and gave it to him, when he took it and tore it to pieces, saying that there was no such thing now as ministering angels, and that if I would bring the plates to him, he would translate them. I informed him that part of the plates were sealed, and that I was forbidden to bring them. He replied, 'I cannot read a sealed book.' I left him, and went to Dr. Mitchell, who sanctioned what Professor Anthon had said respecting both the characters and the translation."
And this would, of course, be later recognized by both Martin and Joseph Smith as a fulfillment of Isaiah 29, and that had to have been particularly powerful to Martin.
Yeah.
The Church History in the Fullness of Times manual in chapter 4 talks a little bit more about this, gives us a little bit more of Martin's story. It says, quote, "Martin visited at least 3 men with reputations as able linguists. In Albany, New York, he talked with Luther Bradish, a diplomat, statesman, world traveler, and student of languages. In New York City, he visited Dr. Samuel Mitchell, vice president of Rutgers Medical College. He also visited a man who knew several languages, including Hebrew and Babylonian. This was Professor Charles Anthon of Columbia College in New York City, who was perhaps the most qualified of Martin's contacts to judge the characters on the document. He was among the leading classical scholars of his day. Martin Harris's trip was significant for several reasons. First, it showed that scholars had an interest in the characters and were willing to give them serious consideration as long as an angel was not part of their story. Second, it was, in the view of Martin and Joseph, the direct fulfillment of prophecy relative to the Book of Mormon. Third, it was a demonstration that translating the record would require the assistance of God. Intellect alone was insufficient. Finally, it built up Martin's own faith. He returned home confident that he had evidence to convince his neighbors of Joseph Smith's work. He was now ready to wholeheartedly commit himself and his means to the bringing forth of the Book of Mormon." End quote.
And if you're interested in more about the story, lots has been written about Martin Harris's journey to the scholars in the East with regards to verifying the characters. And although some, like Professor Anthon, will deny Martin Harris's account, although he has conflicting stories, the fascinating thing is whatever actually happened, and I take Martin's word for it, and the reason I do is that it convinced him. Whatever happened with him and these other scholars, it clearly convinced him that this was God's work, that prophecy was fulfilled, and to contribute his resources to this. So if you're interested in more, though, the Church News on the church's website has an article from 2015. We'll put the link in the description, entitled "Scholar Gives New Insights on Martin Harris's 1828 Visit to Charles Anthon." And it'll give you a more detailed go-through about what we're finding out about that visit and what was going on. So if you're interested in the topic, we'll put a link in the description. But there's a wonderful quote from Elder D. Todd Christofferson, and this is from a church education system fireside for young adults. The quote's in the seminary manual, and I think it really captures not just what's happening with Joseph and the things that are being revealed to him, but what about the things the Lord has revealed to us? Elder Christofferson says, "Be wise with what the Lord gives you. It is a trust. Rather than drifting into carelessness, may your life be one of increasing exactness in obedience. I hope you will think and feel and dress and act in ways that show reverence and respect for sacred things, sacred places, sacred occasions." End quote. Think about those sacred things in your life that the Lord has given you. How have we treated those things? Can we do more to show increasing exactness and obedience for those great blessings of the sacred things the Lord has given us? Maybe they aren't plates of gold, and maybe there's not appearances of angels, but we have been given things in a sacred trust. What a great lesson that Joseph gives us about how to take that seriously.
Wow, and what a great story. This has been a wonderful lesson, and we're just at the beginning of the Doctrine and Covenants. So much more yet to discuss.
So much more.
And we'll look forward to talking to you more about it at our next lesson.
We'll see you then.
This podcast is not officially affiliated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
But we're really big fans.